Idaho 2005. The quiet town of Meridian had always been the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's name, where kids played until the sun dipped behind the foothills, and neighbors trusted one another implicitly. But even the safest towns can hold dark secrets, and for the Thompson family, that secret would fester for over a decade. It was a chilly November evening when 15-year-old Emily Thompson disappeared. The wind cut through the streets with the scent of pine and wood smoke, and the town was settling into its nightly rhythm. Emily, known for her radiant smile, laughter that seemed to echo through the hallways of her school, and an endless curiosity about the world, had walked home from a friend's house and simply vanished. Her backpack was later found abandoned at the edge of a small wooded trail, straps twisted, books scattered, but no sign of struggle. There were no footprints, no witnesses, nothing but silence stretching into the dark. Her parents, David and Helen Thompson, immediately sensed something was wrong. Emily was punctual, reliable, the kind of child who never strayed far from home. When she failed to return, panic set in quickly, a knot of dread tightening in their chests. Calls to friends, her favorite hangouts, local hospitals, even police dispatches came back empty. The night stretched endlessly, and with each passing hour, the horrifying possibility of loss became impossible to ignore. Local law enforcement responded promptly, launching searches of the surrounding woods, nearby streams, and abandoned lots. Volunteers poured in, lighting flashlights like a swarm of fireflies combing every inch of terrain. Flyers appeared overnight on telephone poles, storefronts, and school bulletin boards. "Have you seen Emily Thompson? Missing, call immediately." The town rallied, hearts in their throats, hoping for a miracle that never came. Days turned into weeks. Leads were followed, tips investigated, but each trail ended in frustration. A possible sighting at a convenience store, a tip about a suspicious van, a neighbor recalling someone unfamiliar walking near the woods. Nothing solid. As months passed, Emily's disappearance began to feel like an impossible puzzle. Yet David and Helen refused to let despair win. They transformed their home into a hub of hope and action. Walls covered in maps, strings connecting sightings and rumors, filing cabinets filled with notes on every tip, every piece of information collected over endless sleepless nights. David spent his mornings walking the wooded trails, scanning for signs that official search teams might have missed. Helen dedicated her days to contacting media outlets, organizing community vigils, and coordinating volunteers who refused to give up. They lived and breathed Emily's case, and though exhaustion and grief shadowed every step, they carried on, driven by the unshakable belief that their daughter was out there, waiting to come home. Neighbors recalled seeing David and Helen tirelessly pursuing every lead. Sometimes he'd be out before dawn, flashlight in hand, boots sinking into frost-covered leaves, returning only long after the sun had set. Helen could often be found on the phone late into the night, following up on obscure tips, calling experts, reviewing old reports, and keeping meticulous records of every conversation and sighting. "They were a force," recalled Officer Mark Riley, one of the first officers on the scene. "You could see the love in their eyes and the determination in their movements." They refused to accept that this could be a permanent mystery. Over time, frustration and hopelessness began to take their toll. The official investigation faced roadblocks typical of the era: limited forensic technology, few resources for missing teenage girls, and a growing backlog of cases that drew focus elsewhere. Evidence collected early on, Emily's backpack, hair strands, and a partial footprint near the wooded trail, remained inconclusive. Lead after lead grew cold, and the case slowly slipped from front-page headlines to the bottom of police files. Still, the Thompsons persisted. Their community held vigils every month, and each anniversary of Emily's disappearance was marked by gatherings, candles, and prayer. Even as the town moved on, schools expanded, new neighborhoods grew, and small businesses changed hands. The shadow of Emily's absence remained. For David and Helen, it was a constant ache, A wound reopened with every holiday, birthday, and ordinary day they expected to hear her voice. By 2015, more than a decade had passed. Advances in DNA technology had begun reshaping criminal investigations across the nation, turning what once seemed impossible into solvable mysteries. The Thompson case, cold and seemingly abandoned, caught the attention of a newly established cold case unit within the Idaho State Police. Analysts reviewed the original evidence, carefully preserving what remained and scanning for opportunities where modern methods could extract new information. It was during one of these meticulous reviews that hope sparked anew. Hair strands and fibers previously considered insignificant were re-examined. Blood samples, long thought degraded, were processed using cutting-edge extraction techniques, capable of detecting genetic material from trace amounts. The technology, unavailable in 2005, offered a chance to finally hear Emily's story and hold accountable whoever had taken her away. Detective Laura Chen, who led the cold case review, explained, "We approached the evidence as if it were brand new. Nothing was taken for granted. What old cases teach you is patience and precision. Every detail could be the key, no matter how small it seems. The process was painstaking, often yielding dead ends, but persistence paid off." In late 2016, a DNA profile emerged, a partial match that, when cross-referenced with national databases, revealed a startling connection. A man previously unknown to investigators suddenly appeared in the records. Michael Reynolds, a 42-year-old local contractor, had no prior connection to Emily or her family, yet genetic evidence linked him unmistakably to biological material found on Emily's abandoned backpack. Law enforcement quickly cross-checked employment, residence, and activities. Reynolds had lived near the wooded trail at the time of Emily's disappearance, a detail previously overlooked. Witnesses were re-interviewed, surveillance photos reviewed, and a timeline reconstructed. Piece by piece, the puzzle began to take shape. The breakthrough reignited the Thompson family's hope. David and Helen, now older and bearing the marks of years of grief, prepared themselves emotionally for the next phase, facing the man who had stolen their daughter. With each meeting with detectives, each review of evidence, their resolve strengthened. "We waited 10 years, 12 years, 15 years, David explained. "We never stopped believing. Now we needed to see justice done. For Emily, for us, and for every family who still waits." By 2018, the Thompson family had long settled into the quiet rhythm of a life interrupted. David Thompson, once an energetic mechanic with a laugh that could fill a room, now carried the weight of years spent searching, worrying, and hoping. Helen, his wife, remained the quiet anchor, attending support group meetings and volunteering at the local community center, always carrying a photo of Emily in her purse, always keeping a part of her daughter close. Yet despite the years, no trace of Emily had emerged and the case had grown cold. Then in early 2018, hope returned in a way the Thompsons had almost stopped expecting. A new DNA analysis tool, one that could scan partial genetic material from decades-old samples and cross-reference them with public genealogy databases, flagged a potential match. It was slow at first, a faint signal buried within thousands of unrelated profiles, but the persistence of investigators at the Idaho Bureau of Investigation paid off. That faint signal eventually led to a man named Michael Reynolds, a 42-year-old living in Boise, just 30 miles from Meridian. Reynolds had a clean criminal record. To neighbors, he was quiet, unassuming, polite, the kind of man who mowed his lawn meticulously and waved from his driveway. Few suspected the darkness he had carried for more than a decade. Reynolds' genealogy record showed a partial match to the DNA, collected from the clothing found near the original crime scene in East 2005. That partial match was enough to warrant further investigation. Detectives began building a profile. They learned Reynolds had moved to Meridian in 2003, working at a local landscaping company. He lived alone for years, rarely inviting anyone into his home. Old neighbors remembered him as friendly but reserved. Some recalled that he had once shown a particular interest in Emily, though at the time no one could have imagined the implications. David Thompson was contacted in secret by investigators. When he received the call, his hands shook. He had learned to live with small hopes, tempered by decades of disappointment, but now a possibility of answers appeared real. "We may finally know what happened," the detective told him gently. David drove home in silence, holding Helen's hand tightly. For once there were no words, only the fragile spark of hope growing inside them. Investigators moved cautiously, knowing that any misstep could destroy the case. They began surveillance of Reynolds, taking note of his daily habits, ensuring they could make an arrest without tipping him off. The technology that had pointed them to him was revolutionary, but it was the old-fashioned work, stakeouts, interviews, background checks, that would ultimately secure their success. Neighbors who had casually seen Reynolds around town were discreetly interviewed. Former co-workers were asked about his demeanor, his routines, any unusual behaviors. One co-worker remembered, "He always kept to himself, but I did notice he seemed overly interested in the families with children nearby. He never said anything, but there was a curiosity, I guess." As the investigation continued, the Thompson family struggled to contain their emotions. Every day brought new reports from detectives, small details meant to verify Reynolds' presence in Meridian in 2005. Each confirmation made the possibility of closure more tangible. Emily's friends, now adults, were contacted and asked to provide DNA samples to confirm a match. One by one, the dots began to connect, forming a picture that had been obscured for 13 long years. In April of 2018, the breakthrough came. Laboratory analysts confirmed that DNA from a sample recovered from Emily's abandoned jacket matched Reynolds with near certainty. The piece that had been missing for more than a decade was finally found. Investigators now had enough evidence to take action, but the arrest would require precision. Reynolds had lived quietly for years, and authorities needed to ensure public safety while avoiding any chance he might flee. Meanwhile, the media began to whisper. News outlets reported that the Idaho Bureau of Investigation had identified a person of interest in the long unsolved Emily Thompson case. Social media buzzed with speculation, old community forums filled with anxious commentary. Yet investigators were careful. Reynolds' name was withheld, details were scarce, and the Thompson family remained shielded from the public eye until the moment the case was ready to move forward. David and Helen spent the days leading up to the arrest in a haze of anxiety and anticipation. Helen lit candles in Emily's memory each evening, a ritual that had begun 13 years earlier. David revisited the small collection of drawings, photos, and keepsakes they had saved from Emily's childhood. Each item carried the weight of a life interrupted, a reminder of what had been lost and what they had fought so long to find. Then, on a crisp morning in May 2018, the operation began. Federal and local agents moved into position, surrounding Reynolds' home in Boise with quiet efficiency. The Thompson family watched from a distance, accompanied by detectives who had promised them that finally, justice was within reach. Reynolds, still unaware, began his day like any other. By late morning, law enforcement entered his home and took him into custody. Neighbors were shocked. "He seemed so normal," one remarked. "You never would have guessed. Not in a million years." Others expressed relief that the mystery that had haunted the community for more than a decade was finally being addressed. The Thompson family felt a mixture of emotions: relief, fear, anticipation, and grief. Emily's killer had been caught, but the years that had passed could not be returned. The family, now united with the possibility of answers, prepared themselves for the next step, ensuring that Reynolds would face the law and that the truth of 2005 would finally be revealed in court. The arrest marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The investigation, now backed by a combination of modern technology, traditional detective work, and the persistence of law enforcement, would move swiftly toward the courtroom. For David and Helen, it was a bittersweet moment, the hope of seeing justice tempered by the realization of the years lost and the childhood stolen from Emily. After Reynolds' arrest, the small town of Meridian was gripped by a mixture of shock, curiosity, and a long-suppressed sense of relief. The case that had haunted the community for over a decade suddenly dominated conversations, local news, and social media feeds. People who had lived next to Reynolds for years struggled to reconcile the quiet man they knew with the evidence now revealed. For the Thompson family, the weeks following the arrest were tense and exhausting. Each day brought updates from law enforcement, requests for statements, and preparations for the trial. David found it difficult to sleep. That night, memories of Emily's laughter, her sketches, and her bright smile kept him awake. He would rise before dawn, sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and stare at the photo of Emily on the refrigerator. Helen, equally anxious, spent hours in prayer, quietly pleading for her daughter's justice and for the strength to endure what was coming. The courtroom, when the trial finally began in late summer 2018, was filled with journalists, residents, and law enforcement officers. The gallery included neighbors who had watched Reynolds go about his daily life without suspicion, friends of Emily, and the Thompsons' extended family who had come from across the state. For David and Helen, entering the courtroom was almost unbearable. They had imagined this moment countless times, but the reality of facing Reynolds, seeing the man accused of destroying their daughter's life, was overwhelming. The prosecution presented a detailed, methodical case, combining forensic evidence, eyewitness testimony, and digital records. Investigators testified about the DNA analysis that linked Reynolds to Emily's clothing, the genealogy search that pointed to him, and the careful work used to corroborate his presence near the crime scene in 2005. Detectives explained how even the smallest details, a landscaping schedule, local errands, and neighborhood sightings, were cross-checked to establish Reynolds' movements and opportunities. Former classmates of Emily were called to testify, describing her as a bright, kind, and ambitious young girl, with dreams that had been cruelly cut short. Their words painted a vivid picture of who she had been, helping the court understand the magnitude of the loss. One classmate recalled, "Emily had this way of making everyone feel included. She was the kind of person who left a mark on you without even trying. I can't believe she's gone, and that someone could have done this to her." Neighbors who had observed Reynolds over the years were brought in as well. They spoke of his reserved demeanor, his careful routines, and his polite interactions, emphasizing how ordinary and harmless he had appeared. This testimony reinforced the chilling reality that a predator could hide in plain sight, living unnoticed among a community that trusted him. Forensic experts provided some of the most compelling evidence. They explained the modern DNA techniques that had finally identified Reynolds, highlighting the partial genetic matches that had initially led investigators to him. They described the lab procedures used to confirm the match, the chain of custody maintained for decades-old samples, and the meticulous work required to ensure the integrity of the evidence. Photographs of Emily's recovered jacket and other items of evidence were shown to the jury, the visual reminders of a life violently interrupted. Throughout the trial, Reynolds remained stoic. He did not testify in his own defense, nor did he offer any explanation for his actions. His attorney focused on his client's mental health history and argued for leniency due to the years that had passed. But the overwhelming evidence left little room for doubt. The jury listened attentively, absorbing the details of the investigation, the science behind the breakthrough, and the testimonies that humanized Emily while exposing the cruelty of the crime. The Thompson family was present at nearly every day of the trial. David gripped Helen's hand tightly during particularly emotional moments, feeling both anguish and a growing sense of hope. For years they had been denied closure, forced to live in the shadow of uncertainty. Now, as the trial unfolded, the possibility of justice and of finally being able to honor Emily's memory felt real. Community members, too, followed the trial closely. Local schools held discussions on safety, awareness, and the importance of vigilance, using the case as an example of how even ordinary-looking individuals could harbor dangerous secrets. Residents who had once dismissed Emily's disappearance as a tragic anomaly now grappled with their own assumptions and the uncomfortable realization that they had unknowingly lived alongside a criminal for more than a decade. As closing arguments approached, the courtroom was tense with anticipation. The prosecution emphasized the long journey to justice, reminding the jury of the years Emily's family had suffered, the painstaking investigation that had endured, and the irrefutable evidence linking Reynolds to the crime. They highlighted how modern technology had allowed investigators to solve a case that had confounded law enforcement for years, demonstrating the importance of persistence, innovation, and community support. The defense made a final appeal to the jury's sense of compassion, focusing on Reynolds' quiet life and lack of previous convictions, but their arguments were overshadowed by the compelling narrative of Emily's life and the science that exposed her killer. The contrast between the young girl's potential and the man who had taken her future struck the court powerfully. When the jury finally retired to deliberate, David and Helen waited with bated breath. Each minute felt like an hour. Their hearts ached for the years lost, for the empty milestones, for the celebrations Emily had never experienced. Yet beneath the pain, a fragile thread of hope persisted, hope that the legal system would finally affirm the truth they had known all along. After several hours of deliberation, the jury returned. Reynolds was found guilty on all counts, his sentencing reflecting the severity of his actions. Judge Thomas Caldwell, in his statement during sentencing, acknowledged the profound impact of the crime on Emily's family and the community, emphasizing that no punishment could undo the harm, but that justice, even delayed, must be served. The verdict brought a complex mix of emotions to the Thompsons. Relief mingled with grief, and hope was tempered by the decades of waiting. For David and Helen, seeing Reynolds held accountable was a form of closure they had long feared might never come. It did not erase the pain, but it validated their relentless fight, their unwavering belief that Emily's story deserved to be told, and that her life mattered. In the days following the trial, the Thompson family began the slow process of healing. They worked with counselors, leaned on their community, and established a scholarship in Emily's name for local students interested in forensic science. They visited the memorial that had been set up in her honor, leaving flowers, photographs, and handwritten letters. It was a way to remember, to honor her, and to ensure that her memory would continue to inspire others. The Idaho 2005 cold case, once a source of endless anguish, had finally reached resolution. It became a model for how persistence, combined with modern technology, could bring justice even decades after a crime. Law enforcement agencies across the country studied the case, learning lessons about evidence preservation, the integration of new forensic methods, and the importance of never giving up on missing persons. In the weeks after Reynolds's conviction, Meridian began to settle into a fragile sense of normalcy. The shock of the revelation slowly gave way to reflection, remembrance, and a cautious rebuilding of trust within the community. Neighbors who had once wondered if they should have noticed something were now focused on understanding how a single predator had eluded detection for so long, and how they could prevent such tragedies in the future. For the Thompson family, life remained a mixture of grief and resilience. David returned to his work as a high school teacher, but with a renewed sense of purpose. He started incorporating lessons about empathy, awareness, and civic responsibility into his classroom, hoping that sharing Emily's story would help students recognize the importance of looking out for one another. Helen, meanwhile, devoted herself to supporting families of missing persons. She began volunteering with a statewide non-profit dedicated to providing resources, counseling, and advocacy for those facing the uncertainty the Thompsons had endured for over a decade. Emily's room, once a silent, untouched shrine, was carefully converted into a small memorial space. Photographs, drawings, and personal items remained on display, serving as a tangible reminder of her life and a place where friends and family could honor her memory. A small plaque with her name was placed on the wall, reading simply, "Emily Thompson, beloved daughter, cherished friend, forever remembered." It became a place of quiet reflection, a space where grief could coexist with gratitude for the justice finally achieved. The broader Meridian community also began to process the events. Local law enforcement implemented new protocols for cold case management, inspired by the techniques used to solve Emily's case. Evidence preservation practices were updated, databases were digitized, and officers received additional training in the use of genealogy tools, DNA analysis, and forensic technology. The Sheriff's Department held community meetings to explain the changes and reassure residents that lessons had been learned. Meridian Schools, too, incorporated Emily's story into educational programs on safety and awareness. Students engaged in projects about missing persons, the role of technology in modern investigations, and the importance of reporting suspicious activity. Teachers emphasized that while tragedies could occur, communities could work together to prevent future harm. For David and Helen, one of the most meaningful developments was the creation of the Emily Thompson Foundation. Established in her memory, the foundation provides grants for cold case investigations, funds for modern forensic equipment, and scholarships for students pursuing careers in law enforcement and forensic science. It quickly became a symbol of hope and purpose, a way to ensure that Emily's life would have a lasting impact beyond the grief of her passing. The case also sparked broader conversations about how families cope with long-term uncertainty and trauma. Psychologists, social workers, and community leaders in Idaho used the Thompson case as a reference point for understanding the emotional toll of unresolved crimes. Workshops, support groups, and counseling services were expanded to help other families navigate the prolonged agony of missing loved ones. For the community, the arrest and conviction of Reynolds forced a reckoning. It highlighted the unsettling reality that danger could exist in plain sight and that appearances could be deceiving. It also demonstrated the value of persistence and vigilance. Residents who had once assumed that the past could not be changed learned that even decades-old crimes could be brought to justice with determination. Innovation and cooperation between law enforcement and the public. David and Helen occasionally participated in interviews, speaking about the importance of never giving up hope. They shared their story with other families facing similar situations, emphasizing that every effort to keep a case alive mattered. "It took years, but we finally have justice for Emily," David said in one interview. "It doesn't bring her back, but it reminds us that the truth can't be hidden forever, and that every life deserves to be remembered." Despite the conviction, memories of the past lingered. Anniversaries of Emily's disappearance remained heavy, and the holidays were bittersweet. The family continued to honor her through small rituals, lighting candles, leaving flowers at the memorial, and spending quiet moments reflecting on the person she had been. These acts of remembrance